It was necessary, in order to ascertain the will of the people of the Punjab, Bengal, and part of Assam, to lay down boundaries between the Muslim majority areas and the remaining areas. But I want to make it clear that the ultimate boundaries will be settled by a boundary commission and will almost certainly not be identical with those which have been provisionally adopted. We have given careful consideration to the position of the Sikhs. This valiant community forms about an eighth of the population of the Punjab, but they are so distributed that any partition of this province will inevitably divide it. All of us who have the good of the Sikh community at heart are very sorry to think that the partition of the Punjab, which they themselves desire, cannot avoid splitting them to a greater or lesser extent. The exact degree of the split will be left to the Boundary Commission, on which they will, of course, be represented. The whole plan may not be perfect, but like all plans, its success will depend on the spirit of goodwill with which it is carried out.
When Lord Mountbatten spoke about a plan to divide the country in June 1947, few could have imagined the scale and the disastrous consequences that would come with it. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who was a British lawyer, was commissioned to draw the borders that would divide British-ruled India into two new independent nations, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. Radcliffe was given 5 weeks to decide the fate of millions whose lives changed at the stroke of the midnight hour, quite literally. 14.5 million people migrated on either side of the India-Pakistan border within 4 years, making it one of the largest and most rapid migrations in human history. While the numbers vary, it is estimated that up to 1 million people were killed during the violence in 1947 and around 50,000 women were abducted. Some 12 million people were displaced in the divided province of Punjab alone and up to 20 million people in the subcontinent as a whole. The partition resulted in one of the largest forced migrations of the 20th century.
And imagine what it must be like for the founder to have to suddenly leave everything that they've built over their entire life to flee to somewhere else that they've never been and have never heard of.
Immediately after partition, we came to Ludhiana by the last train which started from Pavalia or that side. In 1956, we got license for making 25 bicycles per day. Now we are making 20,000 bicycles per day.
Refugee handicrafts was open because I had to give work to the women. They come from Pakistan. They've nothing to do. They lost everything.
My father's family originally were from Rawalpindi and my mother was in Lahore. Once partition happened, then they left everything that they had. It was the uncertainty. I think that was the main thing that he always stressed on, that literally from being a well-established business family, we were left with nothing.
But amidst all of this chaos and despair, there were people who rose from the ashes and made enterprises that are household names even today. They represented a rare entrepreneurial zeal and the kind of resilience that is hard to come by. The sort of people that manage to build successful businesses in the face of adversity through sheer grit, hard work, and determination. A nation was in shambles. People were uprooted from their homes. But hope is more than just a 4-letter word. In keeping up with our tradition of bringing you the best of business, this is our Independence Day special. We have with us ace chronicler Gunita Bhalla, economic historian Raman Mahadevan, Ajay Kapoor of Hitkari Potteries, all providing us with insights of what that time was like, the kind of businesses that flourished, the stories behind the people who set up those businesses, and also the tragic demise of some large businesses owing to the partition. We also give you a glimpse of what it was like to set up a business in India. And trust me, this episode is full of fascinating nuggets of information that are sure to stick with you for long after. So fasten your seatbelts and get ready to travel back in time with the morning brief. It's Tuesday, 15th August. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and on this Independence Day special of the morning brief, we rewind to 1947 and take a trip down memory lane.
For generations, we have dreamt and struggled for a free and independent, united India.
Before we delve into the details, it's important to establish the general business atmosphere at the time. And for that, who better than Raman Mahadevan, an economic historian with decades of experience and a special interest in the economics of partition. Here he is trying to quantify the impact of the partition on businesses on both sides of the border. Thank you so much, Raman sir, for joining us on the morning brief. It's a pleasure to have you. I just wanted to start off with how significant the impact of the partition was on Indian businesses.
So, as far as the impact of the partition on Indian business is concerned, there are 3 or 4 industries in India which were adversely affected. These were the jute industry and to some extent the cotton textile, the hides and skin, and some of the artisanal industry. Another major impact of the partition was the disruption in the normal channels of trade. Before partition, Karachi was the preferred principal port for both imports and exports. Now, following partition, of course, this option was not available, and therefore traders had to willy-nilly opt for the much more distant Bombay port. So this pushed up costs, the overall costs of transportation, therefore the costs of imports and exports. The other sort of significant impact of partition was the entire unorganized credit market. So banks in pre-independence India were largely controlled by large corporate houses or business houses. The Punjab National Bank was controlled by the Dalmias. The Central Bank of India was controlled by the Parsis. And then you had the United Commercial Bank of India controlled by the Birlas. But the unorganized credit market for agricultural credit was largely provided by, and for trade, small traders, was largely provided by Hindu sahukars. Now, following partition and the outbreak of violence, all these Hindu traders, bankers, were left with no option but to flee and come back to India. But the most significant thing was the entire agriculture and trade in what became Pakistan, what was in Punjab, was badly disrupted because the traders had left. So there was no credit to be supplied to these agriculture. So agriculture in post-partition Pakistan suffered enormously because of the lack of a supply of credit. So this is so far as the overall impact of the partition insofar as the Indian business is concerned,
But were there some large corporate houses that really gained from partition too?
The partition had a very mixed kind of effect on the corporate houses. Some must have been affected because of the loss of large markets. On the other side, the flip side of it is that a few of the big business houses seem to have made most of this situation and gained from partition. I mean, this included the Birlas and Shriram Group, investment in textiles. The Shriram had a branch of the Delhi cloth mills in a place called Layalpur. And the Birlas had, the Sutlej Textiles Company Limited in a place called Okra in what is now in Pakistan, in West Punjab. Now, both these textile mills, because I've looked at the balance sheet data of these two enterprises of Birlas and Sriram from the pre-partition to the post-partition. I mean, if you looked at the net profit that these two companies made in the post-partition period is greater than the profits that they made in the pre-partition period, which seems to suggest that obviously they have some understanding with the Pakistani bureaucracy, whereby, they could operate meaningfully even in post-partition Pakistan. Likewise, the Dalmias, they controlled 3 cement factories in all. One of them was in India, is in a place called Trichinopoli in southern India. And one was in Karachi, one was in West Punjab. Both are in Pakistan now. And these 2 cement units did rather well in the post-partition. Likewise, as I said, 2 or 3 banks, the Punjab National Bank and the Central Bank of India, had several branches even in post-partition Pakistan, in Lahore, in Karachi, and various other places, And they continued to provide credit and, accept deposits from the Pakistanis in post-partitions.
Raman told me Indians set up hundreds of companies pre-independence. So there are many examples on both sides that he just spoke about. To know some of them, I spoke to Gunita Bhalla, who founded the 1947 Partition Archive, which has over the years built a massive database of interviews with people who grappled with the partition. We'll share some of those here, in fact. Hi, Gunita. Thank you so much for taking time out to speak to us on the morning brief. I want to start off by saying that this episode is actually personal for me because my grandmother was just 8 years old when her family had to leave their plush home in Rawalpindi for Delhi. And the strange thing is that they were so sure they'd return that they just packed overnight bags. But I think once they got to Delhi, they found the air was just full of despair, hopelessness, and loss. And I think it was then that it dawned on them that there was no going back. And I remember my dadi telling me that the train journey from Delhi to Dehradun was the most horrific one, because what was essentially like a 10-hour journey took them 2 days just because the stations were full of dead bodies. And I think she saw the worst that humans are capable of, people stabbing each other, killing each other. And just imagine an 8-year-old witnessing this and describing this place as being one that was smelling of fresh blood. The thought of it evokes a very strong emotion in itself. But amidst all of this and all of these stories that she spoke about, my takeaway was also the sheer gumption that all of these people had, because my great-grandfather began selling shoes in Orissa soon after, and my great-grandmother, who was literally born in the lap of luxury in Rawalpindi and had never worked, suddenly was forced to start working as a receptionist in Delhi. And you could say that life started looking up soon, and they began picking up the pieces and starting over.
No, that's incredible. And, before I go into my story, I just want to comment on this idea of they thought they were going to go back. Now, that is, we hear that in every other story. And most people, like 99% of the people, thought they were going to go back. So that's a huge, it's one of the parts of the tragedy. In terms of my grandparents, all 4 of my grandparents saw the partition, but only 2 of them actually had to migrate because 2 of them were in Lahore. And because they were sick, they had to leave. They were not planning to leave. They were planning to just become Pakistani and stay on because they didn't want to leave their ancestral home. Our ancestors had lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years, though their village was in East Punjab. So my grandmother actually, there was a poet. It's suspected that the poet that was living next door to them could have been Faiz Ahmed Faiz, because Faiz
that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know 100%, but we do know after doing some research that Faiz's house number actually matches the house number next door to my grandparents' home. in Model Town.
Wow.
So apparently this poet who used to sing his poetry or say his poetry, and my grandfather's younger sister who was living with them would listen to over the wall. He was the one who warned the family, like, I know that you guys want to stay here, but you really need to go. And he told my grandfather, if you don't want to go, send your wife and kids. So by August 13th, my grandfather reluctantly sent my grandmother with 3 kids, including my father, over to India. Their train was attacked, but they survived. And then in terms of my grandfather, turned out that the next day, August 13th, so they had 2 big homes. That's why they didn't want to leave. They had a model town home in Lahore, and then they had a really huge Haveli type property. It's a historic property, and he wanted to stay there to protect it. But the police showed up the next day, August 14th, and they said, well, you have to leave because all of this property is now property of Pakistan. So he came to India, and my grandparents didn't reunite for another 6 months. They didn't find each other for another 6 months.
My God.
But they're lucky they survived.
Punita was a teenager when she heard this. And as she grew up, she realized there were thousands of stories like hers which just weren't documented. She wanted to chronicle them, and that's how the 1947 Partition Archive was born. Over the years, Gunita has spoken to veterans of the oldest and grandest business houses in India on their inception stories. But the story she first shared with me was none of those.
I can tell you this one particular business that really stands out to me in that sense. It was called Oberoi Sports. It was one of the biggest sports equipment manufacturers in British India, and they also supplied their equipment abroad. We've done some research on this because, we found equipment and so on. We found tennis rackets that came from this factory. And some of our team members in Pakistan have actually done research on it and sent us photos several years ago of the owner, Ganda Singh Oberoi, or the founder's home even. Oberoi Sports was an absolutely massive complex, very successful business. Ganda Singh Oberoi's mansion was, he lived in a small home, but he was building a very, very large home, which he had to abandon. And it was still there in Pakistan until very recently. It was, from what I heard, it's been torn down by the government or somebody. But it's kind of mind-blowing. I can't imagine what it must be like for the founder to have to suddenly leave everything that they've built over their entire life and to flee to somewhere else that they've never been and have never heard of. I just can't even imagine the heartache and the heartbreak and the suffering that would come from that.
It's said the cricket bats of Oberoi Sports were so fine that they didn't have to be further smoothened by sandpaper. In fact, they used to be sold to British officers. Ganda Singh employed people from across India and paid them several multiples of what police and government officials used to earn at that time. It was the very definition of a thriving, successful business. Here's another one.
There was another gentleman who we heard about. He was in partnership with a British gentleman. He was from Delhi, a native Delhiite, who owned a metalworking factory, and they invented the jingle bell. They claim to have invented the jingle bell, which they were manufacturing and sending everywhere. This particular type of jingle bell is used in kungarus even today. So you hear about all of this innovation and fascinating stuff happening even back then in British India. So I think it makes for a really interesting history that we need to look into.
The next story I want to talk about also started small and then became massive. The person you will now hear, again from the Partition Archive, is Yogesh Munjal of the Hero Group. In his interview with Gunita, he described how his family crossed the border and set up a small bicycle repair shop to make ends meet. That shop is now India's biggest maker of motorcycles, Hero Motocorp.
Our ancestors lived at Kamalia district, then district Raipur of Pakistan, now in Pakistan. Now it is Faisalabad. They were traders. They were trading in cotton at Kamalia. But business was not very good. Therefore, my father and uncles have to go out for service, some job. So my father and uncle went to Quetta and they worked in army workshop, army warehouse. But after some time, my father went to Lahore and he started learning bicycle repair and bicycle trading business. After partition, immediately after partition, we came to Ludhiana by the last train which started from Kamalia or that side. On the way, it was very difficult situation. We saw many things happening, people murdering like anything. But we were safe. Some of our distant family members were also murdered. Nothing was available, no food, nothing for so many hours or maybe 1 or 2 days we were in the train. Some places they stopped train. They announced that next station people are doing violence is there, so we will wait and once it is clear then we will move. So it took too much long time to reach Ludhiana. I think 1.5 days.
So tell us how your father started. Once you got to Ludhiana, how did he start?
They started visiting bicycle parts shops and asking their requirement, what do you require? Then they went to the supplier, asking him to supply that material. So he started getting orders and then he supplied and he got some commission out of that. In 1956 we got license for making 25 bicycles per day. Now we are making 20,000 bicycles per day. But at that time 25 bicycles was also a very big thing for us. Very big thing. And then in 1975 we were making 7,500 bicycles. In 1986 our name appeared in Guinness Book of World Records as largest manufacturers of bicycles. That bicycle we manufactured was very economical. As compared to our neighboring countries, the price was 1/3 of that. We maintained that price purposely so that our poor people should get bicycle, cheap bicycle. Then we started making bicycle parts also. Then we started making moped, Hero Majestic moped at Ludhiana. Then we got collaboration with Honda, largest manufacturer of motorcycles in the world. In that factory we established near Delhi. Since last 14 years we are largest manufacturer of motorcycles also in the world.
Another bike maker that owes its rebirth and growth in business to Indian independence is Royal Enfield, a British motorcycle company taken over by Indians and now a global leader in its segment. There's another brand that went through a rebirth, Refugee Handicrafts, which became one of the first cottage industries of independent India. Set up by the Hungarian-born Indian woman Shobha of Fori Nehru, without whose mention no account of partition can be complete. She not only helped with the safe transportation of many, many Muslims, but also started a massive employment program for the refugees. Here she is in an interview to the Partition archive in 2013. She passed on 4 years later in 2017.
The things that we saw, the things that we heard were terrible. I happened to be asked to work in the emergency room in Old Delhi. I had at my command a young man from the army, Captain Shunil, to help me out from the armies. And we used to meet at night time when we decided that we will send trains to Pakistan. And we did send. We sent one, and we had the news that every single one of them was Qatal Karod, killed. I couldn't send another train for, I think, a week at least. But we had to. The Muslim camp in the Purana Killa got more and more people, so we had to evacuate them. So they had to be sent.
And as you can imagine, ferrying people across the border at that time was not easy at all. But she still did it. Here's one such instance of Shobha Nehru arranging the transfer of a Muslim man to Pakistan.
My husband and I, a Muslim bearer, he said to me one day and to my husband, मैं पाकिस्तान जाना चाहता हूँ. मैंने कहा क्यों? तुम मेरे साथ हो, हम तुमको कुछ नहीं होगा, मत जाओ. नहीं, मैं उधर जाना चाहती हूँ. So, as it happened, Pandit ji had to go to Lahore. And my husband, or an ICS officer, said, take me with you. Why? My mother is there. Oh yeah, that's right. So I sent this bearer of us with him in the plane. And then many years later, when my husband and I visited Lahore, he came to see us. It was so nice to see him there.
Fori Nehru was matched in determination and grit by her mother-in-law, Rameshwari Nehru. She was at the time in Pakistan and Jawaharlal Nehru wanted to bring her back.
Panditji took my husband. You go and see your mother, but she's a very stubborn woman.
And indeed, when her husband, an Indian civil servant, Braj Kumar Nehru, did go to get his mother, here's what she said.
I'm not going to leave Pakistan till every Hindu refugee is evacuated. Before I leave these camps, and they never touched her. And this very stubborn woman was evacuated by our most adorable Muslim friend from Lahore. At the end, when my mother-in-law thought that she has sent every Hindu back to India. So on that side, there are stories about Hindus. On this side, there are stories about Muslims. It was a terrible time. क्या हो गया इस मुल्क को? क्या हो गया?
Fori Nehru's keenness to lend a helping hand made her set up Refugee Handicrafts, which later grew into Central Cottage Industries Emporium, Delhi.
Refugee Handicrafts. That was opened because I had to give work to the women. They come from Pakistan, they have nothing to do, they lost everything. So I was thinking we must give them some work. And the work was what they knew best, hand embroidery and so. I remember we went into a shop, Pandit Brothers, do you know it? In Delhi, or Pandit Brothers. I said, Panditji, I need a place where I can sell the work of the women. So यहाँ बैठो, किधर? We got a carpet, large carpet, Pandit Brothers, in the showcase, where we women, by then war was over, women belonging to the so-called society, told at night, look, have you got anything to embroider? Have you anything to stitch? Have you anything? Says, yes, yes. Then you come to Pandit Brothers. And next day, we found the carpet full of people, women. And there we started this work. And the camp was in Old Delhi.
People like Fori Nehru had to battle massive challenges to facilitate routine supplies for the partition victims. It was difficult for these people to get access to something as basic as their own money in their own bank accounts. Here's Gunita.
So, in terms of my grandfather's story, this is pretty interesting and it should be looked into. Now, the State Bank of India at that time was the Imperial Bank. And when my grandfather was in a refugee camp, completely lost and by himself in Amritsar, his banker was walking around looking for clients. Now, him being a wealthy man, he worked closely with his banker. They had a relationship or whatever. So his banker found him distraught and came up to him and said, "Oh, don't worry, we still have your savings in the bank. And so we're going to give you your savings so you'll be okay." But of course, my grandfather, the story goes, took those savings and just distributed them because he was just like, well, why should I be okay? Look at all these other people. But a lot of banks, the stories we hear over and over again, a lot of banks failed at that time. They just completely failed. I guess it was a time of such chaos. It was the fall of an empire, essentially. And it was a time of such chaos that maybe people stopped paying back their loans, right? Maybe all of that system just completely collapsed. And the one thing, the one bank that I have heard of that retained people's deposits was what is now the State Bank of India. So that's very interesting.
The partition meant a massive churn in business. Raw materials and commodities were hit really badly. So Parle Ji, finding it difficult to access wheat, took out ads asking people to have its new biscuits made of barley. ACC found its cement plants hit hard. Hamdard's iconic Ruh Afza cleaved into two. Two brothers set up two separate factories in India and Pakistan and became household names in both places. And Godrej, which used to make locks, began to make typewriters and office stationery for a new and rising corporate India. For the last story, I come back to my Dadi and one of her prized possessions. Something that she still has in her crockery cupboard that is only brought out for special occasions. And let me tell you, it deserves to be seen in a totally different light. It's her Hitkari tableware. Wondering why? Here's Ajay Kapoor himself as he tells us how Hitkari potteries came into being and made chic tableware and drinkware in the form of ceramics and bone china accessible and affordable to the masses.
My father's family originally were from Rawalpindi, and my mother was in Lahore. Of course, they got married later, but once partition happened, then they left everything that they had and they came to Delhi. Thereafter, my grandfather got into the banking space, and my father at that time joined hands with a friend who was in the cycles business. He worked with him for a while, but then, he always had this passion for ceramic, and therefore he trained first in a factory in India, a factory called Jamshedpur Potteries. And thereafter, he took permission from my grandfather and actually ventured to Japan. He went to Nagoya, where he trained in a Japanese factory. He actually stayed there for 2 years and then came back. His aim was to learn and come back and set up a ceramics unit here in India. And he started with a potter's wheel and 5 workers in a shed in Faridabad. And that's how Hitkari came into inception.
So how did the Hitkari business really grow from there?
Initially, he did start with the more basic stuff, which is, you can say, the lower income level product, which is stoneware and earthenware. His aim was first to get the base production sorted and the quality level sorted. So, those products were more resonating with the masses. By masses, I mean the low income groups. They were cheaper, they were more sturdier, and they were more affordable. And then eventually got into what we call today as bone china, which was more the higher end, the mid to high end segment. That was the crowning glory, actually, that eventually got Hitkari not only a national platform, but an international platform also.
In fact, I was just going to say that my grandmother could very well be Hitkari's, brand ambassador. She has so much stuff from that time, still very much in her crockery cupboard. And it's almost like an heirloom that she's looking to pass on. But coming back to what we were discussing, she kept telling me stories of that time and the struggles and the hardships that they faced, I wanted to get your inputs on how you feel the partition shaped your father as a businessman.
It was the uncertainty, I think, of what they went through. I think that must have been the biggest trauma in their lives. The uncertainty that ultimately then shaped the rest of their lives, where they realized that, look, nothing is for certain. Things can change overnight and you have to learn to adapt. And I think that was the main thing that he always stressed on, that literally from being a well-established business family, we were left with nothing. When we had to come this side, the suddenness of what happened, literally one had to leave everything behind and come over and start from afresh. And that's what I felt his entire life. He had achieved already so much, but yet he was always at it. Morning, noon, and night, he was at it. And I think Partition was a very, very big part of that journey forward, that psyche that was created, that, you can't take anything for granted.
Did he ever go back to Rawalpindi, sir?
No, funnily enough, no. That's a good question. I wonder why, because I was very, very intrigued. In fact, when this 99 World Cup matches happened and India and Pakistan were back to trying to be friends together again, I, in fact, took a trip and went to Lahore. And I was so intrigued because my mother was from Lahore. I found out from her and I actually went to her house and I actually took her on a video call. And I said, Ma, you can't believe where I am. I'm actually here and I'm in your house. And she had tears in her eyes. She was narrating that, go up here, there's this room, there's this room, there's this room. And everything was the way it was. It's just a different family living there. There was a mandir right next to the house. Literally right next to the house. She actually told me, go to the mandir and do puja, because we used to do puja there every morning. And I actually went. I did puja at the mandir. And, and I saw the outside and I showed her. Even today, it says Chopra Nivas outside that house. So that was, for me, it was an amazing experience. I didn't go to Rawalpindi, but and my dad never went back. But this for me was really an iconic trip. Really, it was something that I'll never forget.
The partition is not a time that anyone would want to relive. A celebration of the birth of a new independent India on one hand, and the most gruesome forced migration on the other. But at times like this, there's nothing else to clutch on to apart from hope. People found ways to look on the bright side even through this terribly dark time. My dadi used to tell me stories of how her aunt used to give her 50 paise for food, which she would spend on a bun and a fizzy drink, which is still her weakness, by the way, and is something I've come to love too. Their clothes would be stitched from the same material which was used to make parachutes, only because it was cheap, good quality, and easily available in the market. And their idea of pudding was ghee, sugar, and pulkas. You know how they say experiences shape you? It's spot on. Because even today, if you visit her home in Chennai, you'll find she stashes away some food grains just in case of an emergency. And believe me, if there's someone who saves for a rainy day, it is my grandmother. And she attributes all of these qualities to having grown up through this extraordinarily turbulent period. Some, like our guest today, had the courage and fortitude to rebuild their lives, and some even went on to build businesses that still thrive to this day. No easy feat. There was death and determination, separations and reunions, gloom and gumption, horror and hope, looting and love. After 76 years of independence, when we again find ourselves giving in to divisive forces that rake up communal differences in the real and virtual worlds, I hope these stories will remind us how these very differences led to the most painful birth of a nation imaginable in human history. These stories should remind us we didn't get our freedom cheap, and it took tremendous courage and determination to bring us where we are today. Now, and in this moment, if there's one thing that you take back from this episode, I hope it's the triumph of the human spirit, and nothing exhibits that quality better than what we just listened to. Heroes, every one of them, and the countless others who survived and only came out stronger. And it only seems fitting that we end this episode reminding us of the hero in all of us. Also, a tribute to the late Satyanand Munjal and his three brothers who represent in many ways all the incredible business people from this time, some of whom we have featured in today's episode. All of them captains of business in their own right. Thank you, Gunita, Raman sir, Ajay sir, and Krishan sir for taking us back in time. Also, special thanks to Gunita for allowing us to use the interviews of Yogesh Munjal and Shobha Nehru that were done by 1947 Partition Archive. It's Tuesday, August 15th. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you are listening to The Morning Brief from the Economic Times. On behalf of the entire team at TMB, we wish you a very happy Independence Day. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to listen to last year's edition as well, where we did a 2-part series about Phenolics and took a lay of the land for businesses at that time. This episode was produced by Surohini Jain and sound editor Indranil Bhattacharjee. Executive producers Anupriya Nair, Anirban Chaudhary, and Arijit Burman. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, do share it on your social media networks. A new episode of The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. It streams on Amazon Prime Music, JioSaavn, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. And of course, ET's own audio platform, ET Play. Have a great week ahead. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.